Good morning. Thank you for joining us today for our conversation on how to raise an anti-racist. I'm Jill Savitt, the CEO and President of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. Today we're going to discuss how to talk about race with younger people, because we know that it can be daunting, but it's a necessary task. Our panel is going to talk about the need to discuss race with children and different ways to approach these critically important conversations. We have two experts with us today. Our first panelist is Terra. Terra is the principal consultant for change and transformation consulting. She also created training models and modules to provide trainings for communities throughout the United States. Terra's trainings have resulted in enhanced learning experiences, preparation, knowledge, cultural awareness, community engagement, and developmental skills for her audiences. She has trained youth, staff, and community members around the country through partnerships with groups like the 826 National, City Foundation, the Corporation for National and Community Service, Habitat for Humanity, City Year, Kaboom, the Magic Johnson Foundation, the Chaka Foundation, Target, Bank of America, Starbucks, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and many more. Terra, thank you for joining us. Our other panelist is Madison Brown. Madison is the content coordinator at Be the Bridge. Madison turns up the voices of the marginalized and requires that those in the dominant culture listen, educate themselves on history, grow their empathy muscles, and develop language to understand marginalization and oppression. Madison, it is a pleasure to have you here with us today. So thanks to you both for being here. I thought we'd start first by defining some terms, just to get everybody on the same page. First off, what does it mean to be an anti-racist? And how is that different from simply proclaiming that you are not racist? Terra, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure, thank you. And thank you so much for having me today. I think one of the things that I understand anti-racist to actually fully mean is that it's the active work of being conscious about racism, whether it is your internal work that you must do or looking at the world outside and how racism shows up in that world, and what do you actively do to address those things when you see it showing up. It is not merely the acknowledgement that racism is existing. It is actively doing something to actually make that a shift or a change happen as a result of your understanding of the impact of racism on those who would be impacted by it.
Madison, did you want to add?
Absolutely. One of my favorite quotes is, "Anti-racism is not an identity or a checklist. It's an ongoing decision to uproot the ways white supremacy resides within you, your relationships, and the systems you navigate every day." So when I describe it to students, like what Terra was saying, it's not only this acknowledgement and the constant internal process of breaking down how do I participate in racist structures. But I tell students it's also about this visioning process of what is the world going to look like when our systems are just. If they are just, what does that mean for the world? So I think it's an active part of not only resisting those systems that exist right now, but also setting up and building what do those systems look like when they're filled with equity and filled with justice.
Super helpful. I wanted to take up another couple terms that I think will come up during the conversation. The first is cultural intelligence. How do you define cultural intelligence? Terra?
Okay, sure. For me, cultural intelligence is, again, the acknowledgement and the understanding of the different nuances that exist based on culture, whether those things exist in things as simple as the way people dress, what people eat, the way that they communicate with one another. It is making sure that you are spending time actually educating yourself on the cultural nuances and the way that culture shows up for different people and the implications of culture for people as well when you're doing that. I also think it is the desire not to move through the world with that whole notion of being colorblind. It is the excitement and the appreciation of the colors that actually illuminate our world, and recognizing that there are cultures that come along with those colors and the people that make up those colors as well. So for me, that is what cultural intelligence is, a representation of that. And it is also the embracing of those different cultural identities. It is not simply saying, oh, I see what that is. It is also understanding and recognizing sometimes there's a place that you don't belong in those places because it is not a part of your culture, and anything else feels nuanced, or it feels awkward to the people for whom you just kind of put yourself into their culture without a full understanding of who they are and what they bring to the process based on their culture.
Yeah. It's interesting, just to give a little more context to that. I think colorblind used to be the way that everybody talked about, I'm colorblind, I don't see difference. And what has been revealed in a lot of conversations lately is that denied a lot of people a sense of belonging, because there wasn't this cultural intelligence to look at the whole of a person and their experience and who they are authentically and make that feel welcome. And I think it's just a really interesting point. Madison, did you want to add to that?
I think that pretty much touched on all that I would have said. I think the active part of celebration and recognizing that there's not one way of being, and then how does that acknowledgement and that truth then guide the way that we exact our practice? How does it guide the way that we construct curriculum for schools? How does it guide the way that our businesses look and the spaces that we take up? What does it mean for that? So I think that cultural intelligence also on the people who have power in certain places is extremely important, because it's going to shift the way that our students, our employees, the people who we surround ourselves with then are able to show up in the space that we've created. So yeah, that's all that I would really add on top of what that foundation was.
And then I'll start with you on the final term. These are just things that are flying around now, and don't know if everyone has the same understanding of them. Implicit bias. How do you define that?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I came to understand a lot of these terms, I think implicit bias was one of the things that was the hardest to grapple with, because I think it's the first thing that we jump to when we say that we're not racist people, or I'm not this, I'm not that. But it's that understanding that there are ways that we have been conditioned to understand certain identities, understand certain people groups, certain sexualities, certain gender identities, and we embody and internalize these ideas about how people are supposed to operate, and then how we're supposed to respond to the way that they're operating. So even though I may not identify or think that I'm, holding prejudice towards someone, there's still these deep-seated understandings that I have of their culture that can cause me to act in ways that are discriminatory towards people. So it's understanding that all of us hold implicit biases. They're always going to dictate how we interact with people. And it's more of, like we were saying before, that acknowledgement of implicit bias so that we can deconstruct that, rather than ignoring it and acting like it doesn't exist, so that we can hold on to this self-concept that we have of ourselves of not being racist, not being someone who perpetuates discrimination, but instead calling attention to them and changing them.
Yeah. Terra, do you want to add anything to that?
The only other thing I would add to that is that I think it is one of those spaces, and I certainly hope that people understand that this is the time right now that there has been grace, that the universe is granting all of us to shift in the language that we use. And so when people typically speak about implicit bias, it also comes with this notion that there's some unconscious thing that they have done. And most times people who are of color, who are the ones who receive that bias, will tell you that people were conscious about their bias. What they were unclear about is what led them to believing and accepting those stereotypes, and that led them to the bias. And so if we can move to that space of having the honesty around the language that we may need to shift, because I think that allows it to be something that still feels codifying for people who carry on those practices. And we have to shift in the way in which we talk about bias and racism in order for us to truly make a shift and change those things. And so that's the only thing I would say as a caveat for that, is that most people use the term implicit bias and talk about unconsciously doing things based on bias, but truly they are conscious of what they've done. They just, again, are unaware as why they have accepted these stereotypes or these certain things that they believe about cultures as the reason why they acted on their bias.
Right. It doesn't just get you off the hook.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely not.
So this is all highly nuanced, complicated, very layered stuff we're talking about. How do you start to engage young people on these concepts? You know, and then there are ones that are more maybe straightforward, like white supremacy and racism. How do you start to engage? Let's start with the very young, you know, kids about these topics.
Yeah. I would say that we have to understand that children as young as 3 months old are already building their view of the world. They're already being introduced to certain skin colors, and they're relating and looking to people who have the skin color of their caregiver. They're already beginning to build this understanding, and a lot of socialization, specifically race socialization, is going to happen between 0 and about 7 years old. So there's a lot of research that has been constructed and done around like how are young children orienting themselves in terms of race, and how are they understanding how those impact relationships. So I think that one of the ways that I think about it, especially starting with young children, is they're already building an understanding of what power is. They're already realizing that my parent has a certain level of knowledge or power over me. They can punish me. They can do things to me. My teacher in preschool, you know, there are ways that I'm supposed to operate there. So young children are already building this understanding. They already have this understanding of how we relate to each other as people. So I think when we introduce the conversation of race and racism, putting it into the terms that they're already understanding of, would it be fair, asking a kid, if your teacher treated you differently versus this other person differently just because of the color of your skin? Would that be fair? Not based on any action, not based on anything else, but just your color. And a kid would probably tell you, no, that's not fair. They're already building this understanding of what's fair and what's not fair. So I think when introducing that conversation, and I'm not a parent, as a little note, I have not raised a baby yet, hopefully one day. But I think within those times, we can already introduce it into like the understanding that they already have of the world and that they're building because they're learning how people relate to each other. So that's kind of my first batch of how this would.
Yeah. And interesting, you couched it as the thing that they're looking for is power, who has power in particular situations, which is, I think, a really interesting way, because we know that they'll understand that instead of maybe saying it's about race initially, it's about what's fair.
Yeah, what's fair.
And who's in control of whom. Terra, did you want to add to that?
Just to add to that, I would say it is also about introducing the humanity to them about what people and how they look different. So it is not having a world that only includes images that look like them. It is having stories that you introduce to them of families that are of color, so that they can see that families are the same, and families may have similar struggles or things that they go through as families. But it is, again, the imagery that you are also introducing to your children. It is having conversations about their circle of friends and how do they treat their friends, and why do they treat their friends certain ways? Have they ever seen other people not treat friends well, and what were their actions as a result of that? And if they did nothing, then it's perhaps explaining to them why it's important for them to support someone when they are in a place where they feel like they've been ostracized. So it is, again, having the conversations about what is real for them in their world, especially as they're younger. But the introduction of the humanity of all people in the imagery that you present to your children, I think, is the first way that you begin to do that, because children are very receptive when they are much younger. And it is not until they begin to really understand the paradigms of power and how that actually works that you then have perhaps more work that you have to do in terms of the things that you introduce to them. But from the onset, I would definitely say much of it is what Madison has explained, but also breaking it out into ways in which they understand it by, again, introducing humanity to them by allowing them to see people of many different shades in their world and having that become something that's important to them and normalized in your family. It doesn't seem like it's the anomaly when you do that story, but that it actually is a part of their everyday occurrence, that these are the kinds of things that you have them talking about or experiencing as families.
Right. So Black parents have the talk with their children, you know, and I've heard from Black parents that there's actually a series of talks, depending on how old the child is. You know, for young children, it could be about racist language they hear or a slur they might hear, even from an adult who is in a position of power and what they do in that situation. And of course, for older kids, and especially Black boys and teenagers, Black teenagers, boys and girls, it's about encounters with law enforcement and other kinds of situations. So what advice do you have, particularly for Black parents having those conversations across the age continuum with their kids?
I can start if you don't mind.
Yeah.
I would say the conversations have to be honest, unfortunately, for Black parents, because we do not have the luxury of not giving our children the tools to survive a world that is not yet embracing them. And hopefully these things in this moment in time will shift how the world treats and sees them. However, the world that they currently are in, you have to have some level of honesty that is based on their intellectual capacity to absorb. And you have to be able to share with them. There may be things that will happen, but in the same time, you must be affirming to them that the choices that other people make are not based on who you are and how you show up in the world. You get to choose who you are and how you show up in the world, independent of how other people may perceive or receive that. And so it is, again, the balance that you must have of being honest and truthful about some of the things that are negative in ways in which people will receive them or engage with them, but at the same time affirming that as human beings, the full capacity of their excellence is theirs to make. And so that is the balance that most Black parents are having with their children. And it, as you say, it is a continuation as they continue to grow, as they continue to experience other things. There are other things that then get entered into that conversation that you have with them. And it's not just about law enforcement. Unfortunately, our children face that in their classrooms every day when they are, demonized by people. And you have to be able to, when they get older, talk about how their skin tone is actually weaponized and what that actually means. And so there are certain things that are not fair to them. And you have to be clear with them on that. But at the same time, again, developing a sense of self and purpose for them so that they're not lost in this process and then accept other people's perceptions of who they are.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think speaking as, again, not a parent, but a daughter, I think the best thing my parents did for me was constantly affirming my beauty and my Blackness from the time I came out of the womb. Like that, what I knew of myself was important. Like Terra was saying, of knowing that it's not a fault in me. It's not that my Blackness is evil or should be demonized, but it's something about the system. It's something about this belief system that people have that makes them think that I'm lesser, but I'm not lesser. And so I think that constant communication, the constant affirmation, and my parents raised 4 daughters. So also thinking about how the stories of Black women and femmes and female identifying people are lost in our conversation about police brutality. We see that people have been dragging their feet to hold the officers who murdered Breonna Taylor accountable. That deeply hurts me as a Black woman who knows that I step out on the street or I exist within my home with the same target on my back in some ways, that those same things can happen to me. So I think that it's also a matter of not removing Black girls from this conversation and making sure that we're calling attention to the ways that they uniquely experience violence within the classroom, within schools, within churches and religious spaces, within the public, and all of these ways. There are also ways that girls' bodies are being policed and are being violated that we forget about, that we push under the carpet because of those intersections of sexism and racism coming together. So I think, especially to my parents who are raising Black daughters, I think that there is so much necessity in affirming their beauty and their need to take up space in our world, their leadership, their voice and their power. We have seen how Black women have carried our movements forward since the days of enslavement. And I think really rooting yourself and your children in that history, but also the history of our continent and where we came from, the Caribbean and all of these places, these cultural ties that we have within us. I think that's another important step too, of introducing your children to their ancestors, like truly all the way back as far as you can trace. Take them back to that. Put Black female and male icons in front of them, and make sure that they know that they are tied to a deeper struggle, but also a deep, long history of resilience and strength and truth and beauty. Don't only teach them about what is hard about navigating the world as a Black person, but also what is so beautiful about our experience and about the vision that we cast for the world and how we participate in that. So that would be kind of a layer onto Terra's as well, of really making sure that your children know that their Blackness is necessary, that they were wrapped in this color for a reason and they carry that forward. And that as a parent, you are going to do whatever it takes to make sure that that's affirmed in every space they exist within.
Jill, if I can just add one other thing too, I would say it is also being acutely aware that you must create a space and of refuge for your children to be able to unload the grief that comes with the understanding when they are called that name, the pain that comes with the weight of knowing that the world still does not affirm them in the way that their families are affirming them. It is a space that allows for them to express their anger and to not feel like those are things they must suppress because these are the ways that the world expects them to show up. One of the conversations that my girlfriends and I have had is talking about the fact that in many spaces as Black women, to Madison's point, you show up in dosage because you recognize that the fullness of your Blackness is not something that is going to be readily acceptable. And to have a space to be able to unload where you have, whether it's your circle of friends or whether it is your network of your family members, it is critical for our families to also have that space because the mental piece that comes along with being Black, especially in America, is exhausting. And it requires that there's constant check-in with the mental state of your children, because that is sometimes the space that they are not aware of how to articulate what they are carrying. Sometimes they don't even expose to you the racism that they're dealing with. I've seen these online conversations that are happening on Instagram about Black children in predominantly white schools. And so they understand that they are experiencing these things, but many of the times, because they recognize that Black families have set them up in these situations because they have expectations of greatness, they don't necessarily know that they have a space to be able to unleash and tell you, in this space that you thought was going to be great for my education, well, guess what else I'm learning about who people think I am. And so it's the things that we need to make sure that we are affirming our children, not only in who they are, but also creating the space to acknowledge what they are experiencing in the world and giving them the tools to be able to then pick themselves up and go back out, or when they can't pick themselves up, understanding that someone is there to hold and cradle them through that process until they are ready to kind of go back out and deal with the world as the world is dealing with them right now, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Like W.B. Du Bois called it the second self, that there are these, there's a persona you feel you have to be if you're a Black child at a white dominated school, that doesn't feel like your true self. And so you have to be that true self because that's who you are. And I think that's really important to make space to make sure that self is nourished and appreciated. It's a really interesting point. Now, white kids don't have that kind of the talk, there isn't an analog in the white community for that. What is your advice to white parents about how they talk to their children about these race issues? When does that start and what kinds of conversations do those look like? I mean, you both have talked about that a little bit, Terra saying, don't make it like this is the Black Story Week. that we're, once a year, but you make it a regular part of what you do. What other kinds of advice do you have for starting those conversations? Madison,
Yeah, I would say start them young. Just like Black parents are required to start that young, start them young. Research from 2008 actually showed us that by 5, Black and Latinx children in research settings showed no preference towards their own groups compared to white children. But white children at the age of 5 remain strongly biased in favor of whiteness. So that means conversations need to be starting before 5 years old about what whiteness is. And also, as white parents, you guys have to interrogate, what is whiteness within me? How does it show up? How does it operate? The work is going to also have to start within the parent, but making sure that you're normalizing those conversations around race, around whiteness, around white supremacy, and around the fact that it's not tolerated in this home has to start early. So I think that's what I would say first and foremost. When does it need to start? Before 5 years old. And if you're working backwards, it needs to start today once you get off of this.
Just because I think these are daunting conversations for some people, especially if they're also in the process of examining it within themselves for parents. Is it just, maybe this isn't the right way to frame it, but is it best to do it in response to something that has happened in the world that you're using as a reference point? Is it best to start it just as, this is the conversation I'm going to have today? If that's the case, how do you open that? I'm looking for really practical advice.
I would say, first of all, I think the challenge for some white parents that they're facing right now is they've not dealt with these things for themselves. And so it becomes daunting because you don't have the tools to be able to have these conversations. It would be just like if I had successfully mastered my 5 multiplications and now all of a sudden I'm trying to teach quantum physics. Well, I don't have the capacity for it yet. And so it doesn't mean that I can't get there. It just means that I'm not qualified to step into that role just yet. And so part of it will require that I have to do some work for myself before I move into those conversations with my children, because it is important that your children understand that you are also grappling with these issues and trying to understand it, especially if you have older youth who have not seen you living out these values on a regular basis. If your whole circle of friends and all the people that have always been in their universe are also all white people, then that is part of why at 5 years old, their preference would be all white people, because what you've modeled for them is, this is the group that I feel either safest with or that I feel is best suited for me to participate with. Mm-hmm. It is also not helpful for your children to see you model the onlyness, that you have that only Black friend or that only Latin friend or that only person, because again, usually that person who's the only in the group is not existing in their full self. So they're still not exposing you to the fullest experiences that they have as that person. So it is beginning to have conversations. Sometimes I think, as a former teacher, I found that having visuals for children was helpful, because then you can have a discussion as a family. So finding a film that includes issues of race and racism, and having then a family night around that film, but then discussing, if you were the character who was the recipient of some of these things based on the bias, how do you think you would have responded? What would you have done? Why would you have done those things? If you saw other people doing these things, what would you have done? Why would you have done those things? Have you ever been one of those persons? When you were, what made you do it? Was it group pressure? Was it truly what you felt? What were the things? So it is, again, just having conversations that, yes, may be challenging, but I assure you, having a conversation. I have a nephew who at 25 was killed by police officers, who has a 13-year-old brother. The world did not give me time and patience to say, well, choose when you want to have, like 13, he now has to understand he's getting taller, that he too could be someone that is perceived as a threat by someone, whether it is a police officer, someone who calls the police on him. So again, you have to also recognize that although it may be challenging, it is absolutely critical that you do this, because anti-racist work is not convenient, and it does come at a cost. It may cost you certain things. It is also the reality that some of these conversations will not have to leave your own families, because some of the racism that your children have come to understand started with your family. And so it's unpacking the family traditions that you have and why those traditions were in place, why they need to change. One of the activities I take children through is having a letter that they write to their ancestors, asking why did they make certain choices, and then committing themselves to making different choices. And you as a parent holding them accountable to the things they've ascribed in that letter to the ancestor. So again, it is daunting, but it is necessary. And it does require that as a family member, you have to start doing this work first and then moving to that space of having those conversations with your children. If they're much younger, guess what? You're in luck. They don't have as many things to unlearn that they may have been taught, but also recognizing that your role as a parent is to facilitate that not only are you the person that ensures that they're having those things, but it's to Madison's point, it is that you go to a school and you look at the curriculum that they are being exposed to, because your children actually at some point spend more hours with other people who will influence them than you will as a parent. So it becomes important for you to understand your responsibility to those who influence them. So having conversations about the group of friends that they have, looking at their curriculum, challenging teachers about those things, looking for where culture nights or cultural things exist in their school dynamics. And if they don't, asking the questions why. If you are a white parent who has only white friends, asking yourself why. Why have you chosen only to have those friends? And what do those friends bring to the table that need to be undone? So it is all of those things that, as you talked about, Jill, being completely nuanced. But again, I would say and offer to white parents at this point that this is, again, one of the unique opportunities that the universe has granted you grace not to know everything. Mm-hmm. It is granting you the grace to actually be active in learning and unlearning things that you may have learned before that have been detrimental to the relationships that you would like your children to have when it comes to race and racism and undoing white supremacy. But it is active work, and it may actually be painful work. But the pain of it is worthy because it is no less the pain of the family members who watched their loved one be killed on live TV for everyone else to witness and having to put off their grief because they now are a part of a hashtag movement. So it is, again, understanding that your pain will be no different from anyone else's, but it will be absolutely necessary for your children to be able to thrive in a world that they are also anti-racist and fighting against white supremacy or dismantling it as we understand it.
Yeah, I think also to add on to that, I think that it's important that white parents act with urgency in this conversation. The same way that we have to act with urgency. I think anti-racism, often we get caught up in this reading and learning phase that we don't act. So, you know, when everything started to kind of take off at the beginning of June, a lot of resources were being passed around. A lot of the language kind of landed in, do your learning. And I tell people, to be honest, I don't need your learning. I don't need it to just happen isolated. I need to see your action right now. I need to see what's going on. I need to hear about the conversations that you're having with your family. So I think that it's important for parents to realize that as you're learning, you can be including your children. And I think Terra went over this perfectly. You can be including your children in that learning. But it is so important for us, as people who are going to be parents one day, or people who are parents right now, to stop lying to your kids that they're not going to mess up, and to stop modeling that ideology. Mm-hmm. Be honest with them. I am not perfect at this. I don't know everything, but we're learning together. We're doing this together. And so I think that language of, I think white people are very scared to mess up in this work. And I'm going to tell you right now, you're going to. None of us are doing this perfectly. I don't do work within the allyship that I show towards and participate in with the LGBTQ community. I don't do that perfectly. I am a straight cis woman. I am not going to do it perfectly. And that's something that I have to honor. But it's so important that I have these close relationships with people who can hold me accountable. So if you're a white person who's showing up in this conversation, trying to have these conversations with your children, yet have no people of color around you, no Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian American people around you, no one can hold you accountable for your action showing up, for the words that you're speaking into your children. So like Terra was saying, like, it's so important to have that community around you and also model that for your kids. You can't tell your child to have a diverse group of friends if you're surrounded by white people. You're not modeling it. And I think parenting is a lot of modeling, because then children are going to say, wait, mom, you don't have a diverse group of friends. Mm-hmm. So why are you telling me that I should do that too? So building those authentic relationships, not tokenizing relationships with people, and bringing and diversifying your community, going where you are uncomfortable, and moving into those spaces and showing your children how we step past boundaries. How do we do this work? And how do we do it together as a family? And being honest, when we're watching that movie, yesterday, I showed up in this space and I held and did discriminatory things towards another person, or I watched something happen and I did nothing. There is the requirement that parents show their children that they are not perfect, that they are not doing this perfectly, so that then their children don't harbor this fear and shame of, oh, I'm gonna mess up, so I'm gonna be paralyzed by inaction. Yeah. I'm gonna be paralyzed by that. So I think that honesty in parental and child or caregiver child relationships is absolutely vital, because our children are going to have to move forward knowing that when we authentically show up, we're making it where we are going to mess up, we are going to say the wrong thing, but we're going to have people who hold us accountable, and we're going to be not as prideful as we were before, and we're going to listen, and we're going to change, and we're going to act accordingly, and we're going to do so with urgency. We're going to do so because we realize people are dying. So my slow process is not going to be tolerated. It needs to be urgent. So that's the only thing I would also add.
I think really important what you're saying about urgency is that, you know, this is going to be hard and awkward and painful, and people are feeling shame. White people are feeling shame and guilt and defensiveness. There's only so long you can wallow in all of that and make it be really short, because we have right now this moment, this chance to reimagine our country, and a chance to reimagine how we go forward. And we actually have to get to it. And so I really want to underscore your point is, it's actually not about any of us. It's not about us. It's about what kind of country do we want to create? Roll up your sleeves, get busy. Yes, it's going to be awkward and painful, but it's unfair not to. It's wrong not to. It's dehumanizing not to. And we got to get to that next place. Absolutely. So let's do it.
Let's do it. Yeah.
It is, the key is authenticity, not an activity. And to make sure that people are not treating anti-racist work as an activity that they do, because that in itself will minimize the impact that it will have for your children on how important or how real or valuable this is, and then translate to how important or valuable they see the people who are of color that exist in their community. So it is critical that it may start with activities, because that's the opening for you that makes it easier for you to move into the entree of having these conversations. But it must quickly shift from being an activity to actually being a way of life that you all are moving to, just as if you had introduced a new way that you're going to eat in your home or whatever. It is that serious when it comes to this work being ongoing and authentic work, that it has to shift from feeling like simply an activity or something that, again, many people now have a powerful statement that they've made about Black Lives Matter. But the goal will be to see in 5 weeks, not even years, in 5 weeks, are these people still acting on those same things where they value Black lives?
Yeah, I think that's really important in so many sectors of our society. This is not a box, you can't just box check anti-racism. I did my anti-racism work, I'm done. It's an ongoing, it's actually never done. So,
and anti-racist work, if it's moving to the space of equity, it is going to cost some white people some things. It may cost you some jobs, because guess what? Some jobs you received were simply because you were white in the first place. They didn't have anything to do necessarily with skill sets that other people didn't possess. It is going to be that you don't celebrate that in 2020, when a people have been in your country for 400 years, that you're still talking about it's the first of someone having an opportunity in 2020. So it is, again, going to be painful, because it will come with a cost. It cannot not have things that will have to be shifted and given up in order for equity to be realized in this country for people. And the anti-racist work should be leading us to a space of wanting to see equity become something that is realized by all people who live in this country.
Absolutely. I think also I was watching this webinar with some abolitionist teachers, and one of them, her name is Dina, she was talking about how sometimes the question of how we're going to spend our privilege, how are we going to use our privilege, can be really offensive, because you're telling me that you don't actually want to give it all up. And when we think about anti-racism work, and with our goal being justice, our goal being equity, that anti-racism is the pathway to getting there, that resistance, that rebuilding, that reshaping, we have to realize that when we say spend our privilege, we mean get it down to zero, where it zeroes out, where I no longer have it. I can no longer hold on to that as the thing that pushes me forward, as the thing that pushes me into certain spaces and certain jobs. I can no longer ride that wave. So when we think about that question for ourselves as people who are within children's lives, who are strong voices and trusted voices, we have to model the fact that the world that I want is one where I don't hold privilege anymore, where the hierarchy's gone. And we have to be clear and consistent, but also very vocal about what our vision is for the world. There are some people who are doing anti-racist work where that's not their vision for the world. Mm-hmm. There are some people who are doing anti-racist work where that is the vision, where we say, I'm willing to lose, I'm willing to sacrifice, I'm willing to give up. And so I think also modeling that for our children, and making that the language within our homes when we're talking about this, the model within our schools, within our companies, within our churches and religious spaces and all of those things, we have to be very clear and willing and to write down what is our vision for why we're doing this. What's our purpose statement? What's our mission? What's that vision? And then let that guide us. But definitely that sacrifice piece is going to have to be one of the core tenets of this work moving forward.
And if I could just add one other thing quickly, Jill, as we talk about language, if 2020 can be the year that we stop using the term privilege, because what we have recognized that it should not ever be a privilege to be ignorant of the kind of pain and conditions that exist for people that are not you. If we are talking about really undoing this work and being anti-racist, then we must call it what it is. Either you are a benefactor of racism, you are a person actively doing and being racist, or you are a person who is unconscious of the advantages that have come to you because of race, but you are not privileged. There is no privilege in that, and we should stop teaching our children that there is some level of privilege that exists, that you get to ignore the conditions of other people that don't have those same things because they don't happen to also be white. And so for me, it is again going to be the shifting and the language that we have used to often make people who are benefactors of racism be comfortable with that racism. Mm-hmm. And so if we make it uncomfortable, perhaps we will also understand the urgency of us needing to make those shifts in the way in which we talk to our children, in the way in which we interact with other people, when we use language that is accurately describing what people are actually experiencing in this world.
And stakeholders in racism, they've invested, they're getting returns.
Yeah. The word complicity is a really ugly one, but you have to sit with it. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people are going to have to sit with what it means to be complicit in a human rights abuse. You know, that's hard for a lot of people, and I think it's new for people to think about themselves in that way. Mm-hmm. But it's very interesting that we've chosen this word privilege, or that's become the parlance for something that is really ugly. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm going to turn to the questions, if that's okay with you guys, because we have people burning up the chat. So a mom is asking, how do I have a conversation with my daughter who has watched so many princesses, mostly white, and has started saying she doesn't like the color of her skin?
I think it's to Madison's point. There are a number of beautiful princesses and queens that exist of color, in particular African queens, that I would definitely say it is just a matter of doing. The beauty of technology is that Google, Siri, whatever is the method that you want to use to get to information, you are only 3 seconds away from finding out something that you need to know. And I think the beauty of that for parents now is it is accessible for you to be able to find additional resources and things to be able to share with your children. And so that is what I would actually share with her, the parent who's asked that question. Google images of Black princesses or Black queens, and if it's a Latin person, whatever the cultural dynamic is that you're seeking, you just enter that in, and trust me, there will be a plethora of things that will come up. And then you start having conversations with your child to say, oh, you know what? I see that you resemble this particular person. Do you see that your nose is like their nose, or the shape of your face is exactly like this beautiful princess here? And so it is, again, not only showing them in the images, but allowing them to understand where they show up in the same way that those people do that they are looking at. And then it is also making conscious decisions about what you expose your children to. My parents did not allow us to watch Disney, so I'm not one who grew up as a Disney kid. Like when people would talk about Bambi and all this, I never had a concept, because Disney, unfortunately, in many cases, had the ominous characters were always darker characters or coming out of dark shadows. And so for us, it was a conscious effort that my parents actually had us create our own stories. And so we became our own princesses or whatever in story time with my siblings. And so it just so happened it was all 3 girls, so it was easier for us to do that. But certainly, I would also say showing images, but allowing them to generate their own ideas of what beauty is by having playtime and incorporating that into their existence, so they're actually seeing themselves as beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I was going to say, one, definitely the imagination piece. I think the most beautiful thing about children is their imagination. I miss having that amount of imagination. So I think that definitely, like you were saying, pointing them towards like, well, what princess do you want to be? Like, what does she look like? And how are you? And how can we dress you up? And let your daughter put on some makeup and all of these things, and really just like push her into realizing that the beauty that she has is the standard. I think on top of that too, helping her to recognize that there were queens and princesses who were real, telling them about how they ruled their kingdoms, how they came alongside kings, how they showed up in the world, and the difference that they made. I think that's a really beautiful thing about history too, is, you know, I remember doing school projects on Sojourner Truth and Madam C.J. Walker and these women, and Harriet Tubman, and these women, then their vision for the world, but also the way that they made that movement, the way that they broke those boundaries, became my guide forward, became my understanding of what I was capable of. So I think tying them back again to, like I was saying, to ancestors, to have them be their guide. I think that's the beautiful thing about ancestors, is they can guide us. When we believe in that spiritual practice of connecting with them, they move us forward. And so giving your daughter access to that ancestral just guidance period, and showing her like these people had real tangible handprints on our world as it is right now. And so connecting her with that can be something. But I know the feeling of being that young girl. So I also want you to know that there is hope, and there's hope for her stepping more into the beauty that she is, but she's gonna have to be affirmed in it constantly. Because at school, she's gonna hear that she's pretty for a Black girl. At school, she's going to hear different things around her that either say things about how she takes up space. And so making sure, like we were saying, that we create refuge for our young people is really important.
And 2019 gave her 5 queens: Miss America, Miss USA, Miss Universe. So there were 5 of them who had the spectrum of colors that we exist in, spectrum of hair textures that we have. So again, in addition to the ancestors, there's also current information that you can share with her, so she can see the beauty and the spectrum of beauty that exists with Black people who actually are wearing a crown and then buying a crown for them. I still wear one for my birthday every year. But yes, just allowing them and creating a vision board so that she actually gets to see what beauty looks like in all different shapes, sizes, and all of those things.
Absolutely.
So I have a question from an educator. I'm going to read it because it's a little complex. Within all schools, there is a particular structural foundation for discipline that students follow. How, as an educator, do you navigate through the struggle of balancing discipline and student care, with racism being at the forefront of the student's perception in a manner that assists the student, but adheres to the policies in place?
Well, as an educator, I would say part of it is challenging your administrations. Teachers have staff meetings, they have all these kind of PD trainings. And so it is actually requesting that people come into your school to talk about the dynamics of how race plays a part in how we discipline children in schools. What are the perceptions that we have about children? There was a study done years ago that talked about the way that teachers ignore girls' hands when they go up in math classes and science classes. And so it's all of those things that we bring to our own identity when we step into a classroom. Unfortunately, certification doesn't rid you of your racist ideologies when you step into a classroom environment. And so it is the responsibility, when you see these things happening, of challenging your administrator and say, I think that we may have an issue here. Because if we look at the number of children who are disciplined and how they're disciplined at our school, clearly there are some biases, and I'm not making any assumptions or assertions about people being racist. However, the way in which we are implementing our structure, it definitely rings true for how systemic racism sets them on a journey or a path to how the justice system will also treat them. And so just having those conversations, again, including them in your professional development training for all of your staff, having people do honest assessments of how they discipline, why they discipline students in their classroom. But also, again, it is the engagement of families. I think it is critical that families also then be involved in these conversations when they're talking about how their children are disciplined. Parents should be able to say, this is the impact that that disciplinary action had on my child as a result, because many times people give the disciplinary action, but they don't see the flip side of that child when they go home, when they're suspended, or whatever that is. So I think it is the engagement of families, it is the professional development, but it is using your voice to say, I do not believe that this is correct. And I am open and wanting to find a way for us to make this better for all the children that exist in our classrooms.
Absolutely. The other work I do is in the education realm. So after I graduate with my master's in social work, I'm going into teacher education, specifically around building anti-racist and abolitionist schools and spaces. So one of the things that I often say to people is policies were written by people, which means they can be unwritten and they can be rewritten. So when we're thinking about this, like, oh, policies are like set in stone, they're actually not, which means we can change them. So if they are causing harm, and if we want to build schools that are trauma informed, that are anti-racist, that are abolitionist, we have to understand that we're going to have to rid ourselves of some of these policies. And the other thing I would say is arm yourself with data. Bring in civil rights data, bring in the data from your school district and show them this is the impact by race. We see that race has more of an impact than social class. And so when we bring that data in and we say our Black students, our Latinx students are experiencing these discipline policies at higher rates than white students, we have to do something here. We have to. There's something in the way that teachers are relating to their students, which means that they are tending towards punishment. There are things that we need to change in the policy and how it's written itself. And we need to think of new pathways for students that are either causing disruption in the class or, acting out or starting fights and inciting violence. There has to be other pathways than kicking them out of school, then calling the police, then doing all of these things that build this pipeline from school to prison and to house arrest and to all of these ways. So there are other ways that I think that teachers need to step into that power in saying, this is not right. Like Terra was saying, this is not right. And we need to do something else. Can we be a little bit more creative in the way that we're going to show students what happens when you make mistakes? But also standing by what we do not tolerate, but that there has to be another way that we communicate that than just strictly resorting to punishment.
Yes.
Yeah, and I just want to underscore a point about parent organizing and advocacy.
Mm-hmm.
It is so important to do, and if you want to change something in your school and you can't find other parents to do that with you, certainly don't stop, go for it. But it does help to have other parents to first start by documenting the problems that you see with the experiences of a wide range of people. I will just add that,
Absolutely.
that I think sometimes people try and go it alone, and that's hard. It's hard in any case, it's harder alone. So it's important to ally with other parents and to document the problem. And as Madison was saying, there's so much research that documents these negative outcomes that happen. Avail yourselves of it. Someone is asking, why is there so much emphasis on diversity and inclusion training, and is that the solution?
No. So I'm for equity training, because diversity and inclusion typically only means that people of color are allowed to come into organizations or into institutions and witness racism firsthand, as opposed to having to hear about it because they've not been included. Yeah. Diversity and inclusion is really when you're talking about checking boxes. It is if I need to aesthetically look as if I am embracing or have included other people, then that's what diversity and inclusion achieves. Diversity and inclusion does not do anything to move the needle toward equity. It does not do anything to ensure that people are doing anti-racist work. It does nothing to do, or has nothing to do with really even engaging or embracing difference within your community, because many organizations that talk about diversity and inclusion also talk about tolerance. And most people of color do not wish to be tolerated. No human being typically likes to be tolerated. And so again, no, diversity and inclusion is the first step to understanding that you are in an all-white space. That's all that diversity and inclusion does. It is the acknowledgement that we need to have people who don't look just like all the rest of us who happen to be all white in this space. But if you only are including those people and accepting them to, or expecting them to only show up and operate just like all the white people, then you don't have diversity and inclusion. You simply have people of color who function as white people do. And so you still have not achieved diversity and inclusion, nor are you moving to the space of equity. And most Black people right now are talking about not even equality, because equality simply means, like, for instance, we have equality when it comes to schools. Equality says all children have access to schools. Equity says all children should have access to quality education. And so there is a difference in equality and even equity. So most Black people are not even talking about equality at this point. We are talking about shifting how the power structures exist, how people pay themselves, how people acknowledge or value people. That is what equity is about. And diversity and inclusion absolutely does nothing to get us to that place. And so my friends and I jokingly say, don't Starbucks us. Because Starbucks talked about diversity and inclusion and spending an afternoon doing that work. But yet you see, and many of the things that continue to happen in their places still show that they did nothing to talk about equity and the shifting of what needs to happen to people and their spirits when it comes to humanity, versus simply looking and acknowledging that there are people who are different within your spaces.
I think the other thing is that diversity and inclusion trainings are not disruption. They require no one to give anything up, because the space doesn't actually change. Again, it's just that acknowledgement that, oh yeah, there's a lot of white people here, and maybe we should do something different, and maybe we should operate a little different. But there's no accountability and no sustainability built into what diversity and inclusion trainings do. They just stop. There's no active restructuring of the ways that our business are working, the way our school looks, and there's no sacrifice. Again, pointing back to anti-racism is going to require sacrifice. It's going to require people giving up power. It's going to require power being redistributed, resources being reallocated, all of these things. So if your diversity and inclusion just stops at, we hired 2 more people of color, but those people are not able to show up fully. And when they do show up fully, they're fired. What was your training for, and who was it for? Like, and not paid well. Yeah. Who was it for? Why did we do this? And often we see in diversity and inclusion trainings, which is why I don't like them, is that white feelings are coddled too much. It usually ends with the Black person or the person of color saying something that was true, a white person crying or feeling shamed or becoming angry, and the focus shifts to, how do we help you? How do we make you feel okay in the fact that you're operating within white supremacist structures and that nothing is changing, and making sure that we can coddle you back down to what we have set as our status quo. I think with equity and anti-racism trainings, what we're doing is we're saying the status quo has to be different. The status quo is that you're no longer coddled, you're held accountable. And these people who have shown up, these Black and brown people who enter into our space are prioritized and centered, and their voices are elevated, and we listen to them and we change accordingly. So that's the other thing that I would add on top of that, of why diversity, we're not going to diversity and inclusion our way into revolution. We're not going to diversity and inclusion our way into justice. And so we have to begin to be honest about why we're doing it and who it's for, and shifting towards a completely different framework for what we're training people in, and how those accountability and sustainability structures and systems are then built into that as well.
Yeah, I am so sorry we have to end. This has been a fantastically helpful, honest, genuine conversation. Thank you, Terra. Thank you, Madison. We'll look at the chat. People are posting. Really appreciate your expertise and your honesty. Thank you so much. Please check our website at equaldignity.org for our upcoming programs. We're also part of Equitable Dinners, which is a monthly conversation. The next one is July 19th. So please look out for that. It's on education, so very ripe topic. And here are some of our other upcoming programs. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, and hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.